Morning to lecture 9 in anatomy of thorax. Our objectives is to describe the course, relation and the branches of aorta and pulmonary trunk, and the anatomy of vagus nerve and phrenic nerves. The aorta, this is the main trunk that carry the oxygenated blood from the left ventricle to the rest of the body. It will be divided into three parts: the ascending aorta, the arch of aorta, and the descending thoracic aorta and abdominal aorta. So in the thoracic region, it is divided into ascending aorta, arch, and descending aorta. The ascending aorta, it started at the base of the left ventricle. It runs upward and forward behind the right half of the sternum. So, at the base of the left ventricle, ascend upward and forward, become just behind the right half of the sternum at the level of the sternal angle. إذا يبدأ من البيس of the left ventricle وينتهي at the level of the sternal angle. لأن بعد الsternal angle the arch of aorta is started. So from the base of the left ventricle to the level of the sternal angle, this is the ascending aorta. It lies within the pericardium, within the fibrous pericardium. And never forget that the both aorta and pulmonary trunk are enclosed together by serous pericardium. What are the branches of ascending aorta? First one is you remember the right coronary artery that rises from the anterior aortic sinus. The right coronary artery. The left coronary artery which arises from the left posterior aortic sinus. So the right and left coronaries are the branches of the ascending aorta within the fibrous pericardium. The arch of aorta, it started at the level of the sternal angle. ما ذكرنا إنه من البيز of the left ventricle إلى sternal angle, this is the ascending. هسه نكمل from the level of the sternal angle. It lies behind the manubrium sterni. It arch, انتبهوا الأشن الارching مالته. If you look to this slide, at the level of the sternal angle it started the arch of aorta. It lies behind the manubrium sterni. It arches upward, backward and to the left, just in front of the trachea. Upward, backward and to the left, in front of the trachea. Then it passes downward to the left side of the trachea at the level of the sternal angle. إذا يبدأ at the level of the sternal angle behind the manubrium sterni. It arch upward and backward, then become to the left in front of the trachea, بعدين to the left side of the trachea. بهاي المنطقة at the level of the sternal angle خلاص ينتهي. It ends, the arch of aorta, it ends at the level of the sternal angle to become continuous downward. And تحت the sternal angle it will become continuous downward with the descending thoracic aorta. So what are the branches of arch of aorta? Three main branches. These are three main branches of the arch of aorta. First is the brachiocephalic artery. It divided into right subclavian artery and right common carotid arteries. Second is the left common carotid artery. Third is the left subclavian artery. Three branches arises from the arch of aorta. The descending thoracic aorta قلنا يبدأ وين؟ at the level of the sternal angle. منطقة انتهاء الأورتيك arch خلاص the continuation at the level of the sternal angle will be the descending thoracic aorta. It descends downward in the posterior mediastinum, right? Downward in the posterior mediastinum. It inclines forward and medially to reach the anterior surface of the vertebral column. It inclines forward and medially to reach the anterior surface of the vertebra. Then at the level of T12, it passes behind the diaphragm in the aortic opening and to become continuous downward with the abdominal aorta. So it runs downward in the posterior mediastinum, it inclines forward وحاول أن يكون medially forward and medially reaching the anterior surface of the vertebral column. At level of T12, you remember, at level of T12, it passes through the aortic opening to enter to the abdomen and become in the midline, of course, to become continuous with the abdominal aorta. What are the branches of descending thoracic aorta? You remember the lower 9 intercostal arteries, posterior intercostal arteries of lower 9 intercostal spaces arise directly from the descending thoracic aorta. Subcostal arteries also. Subcostal artery, it runs along the lower border of the last rib, which is the 12th rib. This it enters to supply the abdominal wall. زين على طول ما انه الديسندنج اورتا المنطقة اللي ينزل يمها يعطيها برانشز، يمشي يم البريكارديوم يعطي بريكارديال برانشز، يمشي يم الاسوفيجاس يعطي اسوفيجيال برانشز، يم اللنج يعطي برونكيال ارتريز. فإضافة إلى البوستيريور intercostal arteries, lower 9 intercostal spaces, subcostal arteries arises directly from the aorta, descending aorta. إضافة إنه أكو small branches يعطيها على طول ما هو descending downward, pericardial branches, esophageal and bronchial branches. The pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk, it carries the deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs to be oxygenated there. So, it leaves the upper part of the right ventricle. It runs upward, backward, and to the left. The pulmonary trunk is just 5 centimeters in length. It ends in the concavity of aortic arch. If you look to this slide, you will see that it ends in the concavity. بالتقعر مال aortic arch, it ends by terminating or by dividing into 2 branches. Right pulmonary artery that enter to the right lung and left pulmonary artery that enter to the left lung. وطبعا البلمونري trunk it is مثل ascending aorta, it is in the fibrous pericardium, it lies within the fibrous pericardium. So it starts at the upper part of right ventricle, ascending upward, backward and to the left, ends in the concavity of aortic arch. ينتهي بهذا التقعر، منطقة التقعر مال aortic arch عشان ينتهي by dividing into right pulmonary artery to the right lung and left pulmonary artery to the left lung. Ligamentum arteriosum. It is just band, fibrous band. If you look to this slide, it connects the bifurcation of the pulmonary trunk to the lower concave surface of aortic arch. يعني منطقة bifurcation of the pulmonary trunk اللي راح يكون موجود بالتقعر مال الاورتيك ارش بين البلمونري ترانك والتقعر مال الاورتيك ارش راح تمتد هذه الفايبرس باند. What is this? What's the origin of it? It is the remnant of the ductus arteriosus. Normally in the intrauterine life, this ductus arteriosus أو arterial duct, it is patent, تكون opened to allow the blood to come between the aorta and pulmonary trunk. البلد راح يمشي بين البلمونري trunk والأورتا، من الأورتا راح يعبر بلد للبلمونري trunk وهكذا. This after delivery it must be obliterated or blocked. This is normally it should be blocked or obliterated after delivery. وحيصير بيها fibrosis وتكون عبارة فقط عن fibrous band اسمه ligamentum arteriosum. حوالين هذا الليجامنتم arteriosum يجي left recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks around it, the lower border of it. Around the lower border of ligamentum arteriosum راح يجي left recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks يعني يفتر around the ligamentum arteriosum. Right? The vagus nerve. طبعا هذه صورة بالforceps pointing to the region of ligamentum arteriosum between the pulmonary trunk and the undersurface of arch of aorta. الفيجاس nerve عندنا right vagus nerve and left vagus nerve. If you look to this slide, you will see طبعا this yellow one is the vagus nerve. The right vagus nerve, it runs posterolateral to the brachiocephalic artery. If you look carefully to this slide, it is posterolateral to the brachiocephalic artery. The vagus nerve, it passes behind the root of the lung. اثنين من right vagus وال left vagus, they descend or they passes behind the root of the lung. So the right vagus nerve, it descends behind the root of the right lung, and you remember it shares in the formation of the pulmonary plexus, which is the autonomic plexus. It gives parasympathetic fibers of the pulmonary plexus to supply autonomic innervation of the lung. زين شارك بالpulmonary plexus, then it will leave the plexus, passes to وين ينزل بعد للposterior surface of the esophagus, share in the formation of esophageal plexus, and you remember the esophageal plexus also. We will talk about it in the next lecture. Yes. إذن ال right vagus nerve, it runs behind the root of the lung, behind the root of the right lung, يشارك in the formation of the pulmonary plexus, يخلص then leaving the plexus وينزل posteriorly in the posterior surface of the esophagus, share بعد أيضا sharing in the formation of the esophageal plexus to give autonomic innervation or parasympathetic fibers of the esophagus. Then it passes in the esophageal opening of the diaphragm. بالesophageal opening of the diaphragm, or reach to the posterior surface of the stomach. The left vagus nerve, if you look carefully to this slide, it lies between the left common carotid artery and left subclavian artery. هذه بالleft vagus nerve بين left common carotid والleft subclavian artery. It crosses, لاحظوا العلاقة مع aortic arch. It crosses the left side of aortic arch. يعبر left side of aortic arch. بهاي المنطقة ما مبين بالرسم الليفت phrenic nerve راح ينزل قدامه crossing the left vagus nerve. يعني يجي الليفت phrenic nerve crossing the left vagus nerve as the left vagus nerve crossing the left side of aortic arch. Okay, then it runs backward behind the root of the left lung. وأنا ذكرته إنه both vagi descend behind the root of the lungs سواء right side or the left side. زين ايش عمل؟ descend behind root of the left lung, share in the formation of the pulmonary plexus. خلص leaving the plexus. هذا ايش راح يعمل؟ it will descend anterior to the esophagus. it descend to the anterior surface of the esophagus. بعكس الرايت اللي يروح posterior. الليفت فيجاس يمشي anterior, descend anterior on the anterior surface of the esophagus, and it shares in the formation of esophageal plexus. It gives parasympathetic fibers to the esophageal plexus. Then also it runs or descends through the esophageal opening in the diaphragm in front of esophagus. قلت أنا it descends anterior to esophagus, reach to anterior surface of the stomach. الرايت يروح على posterior surface of the stomach والanterior ينزل على anterior surface of the stomach. هذا descend left descend anterior to the esophagus والright vagus descend posterior to the esophagus. Both vagi share in the formation of esophageal plexus and pulmonary plexus. Both vagi descend behind the root of the lungs. What are the branches? The vagi, they supply the lungs قلت through pulmonary plexus والesophagus through esophageal plexus. Right vagus nerve, it will give a branch which is the right recurrent laryngeal nerve. The right recurrent laryngeal nerve, it arises in the neck. It hooks around subclavian artery, then it ascends upward. يعني right recurrent laryngeal nerve which arises of course from the right vagus يعمل hook أيضا يفتر. If you look to this slide, hooks around subclavian artery and ascending upward. Hooks and ascending upward. بالleft side, left vagus nerve, it also gives left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Also, it hooks, this left recurrent laryngeal nerve, it hooks around ligamentum arteriosum and ascend in a groove posteriorly between the trachea and esophagus. Ascend in a groove between the trachea and esophagus. منو راح يمشي؟ left recurrent laryngeal nerve. طبعا left recurrent laryngeal nerve, it arises as just the nerve when it crosses the arch of aorta. بهاي المنطقة it arises hooking يفتر around the ligamentum arteriosum and it ascends in a groove between the trachea and esophagus. The innervation, it supply all muscles of the vocal cord. All the muscles of the left vocal cord except the cricothyroid muscle with tensor of the cord supplied by external laryngeal branch of the vagus. Okay, so the innervation, it supply all muscles of the vocal cord except cricothyroid and tensor of the cord, which is supplied directly by external laryngeal branch of the vagus. Phrenic nerves. The phrenic nerve, it arises from the anterior rami of the third up to fifth cervical nerves. يعني الانتيريور rami of C3, C4, C5 cervical nerves. The right phrenic nerve, if you look to this slide, it descends in the thorax along the right side of the right brachiocephalic vein. It is on the right side of the right brachiocephalic vein and superior vena cava. يكون على اليمين on the right side of a brachiocephalic vein and superior vena cava. Here it descends in front of the root of the lung, in front of the root of the right lung. يعني بعكس الفيجاس. الفيجاس it descends behind the root of the right lung, but the right phrenic nerve it descends in front of the root of the right lung. يعني اثنينهم الفرينيك nerve بالرايت وبالليفت descend in front of the root of the lung. Then it descends along the right side of the يم البريكارديوم, along the right side of the pericardium and inferior vena cava. The terminal branches runs into the caval opening, and you remember the caval opening in the diaphragm. The right phrenic nerve enter or it passes through the caval opening to the diaphragm to supply the central part of the peritoneum. So this is the right phrenic nerve. What about the left phrenic nerve? It descends in the thorax along the left side of left subclavian artery. And this is the left subclavian artery, descend along the left side of the left subclavian artery. It crosses the aortic arch, descend crossing aortic arch and left vagus nerve. يمشي قدامهم, crossing them. And then it descends in front of the root of the left lung, as I said. That phrenic nerve descends in front of the root of the lung. Then to the right, to the left side of the pericardium. نفس قصة الرايت. Descend to the left side of the pericardium. On reaching the diaphragm, the terminal branches, they pierce the muscle. They pierce the muscle of the diaphragm and supply the central part of the peritoneum. ما حيدخل بالكيفل opening مثل الرايت. لا, هذا pierce the diaphragm وينتهي هاك terminal branches and supplying the central part of the peritoneum. And thank you for today.